Please rise. Court is now in session.
I strenuously object. A legal podcast brought to you by the Pittsburgh Law Firm of Flaherty Fardo is now in session.
All those seeking information about the law and legal matters affecting the people of Pittsburgh and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, half-baked opinions, and a dose of self-indulgence are invited to attend and participate.
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
The defense strenuously objects.
You would!
Call the first witness.
Hello and welcome to a very special holiday episode of I Strenuously Object. We got the 4th of July looming fast upon us, and you know the grand tradition here is to celebrate the 4th by allowing rank amateurs to play with explosive devices.
Celebrate the independence of your nation by blowing up a small part of it.
All right.
Obviously, as a personal injury lawyer, this is a thing that implicates my profession and in cases I've dealt with in the past, and we'd like to have a chance to talk about it today. So, and we're very lucky. We're joined here today by Dr. John Steinberg, who has as much experience and expertise when it comes to fireworks as anyone, really. We're talking about a man with 30 years experience in pyrotechnic chemistry, manufacture, and displays, a man who has served as an instructor in both civilian and law or fire enforcement training programs relating to fireworks and pyrotechnics. He's done displays himself as a lead and a co-lead. He's toured manufacturing facilities on 3 different continents, examining the manufacture of fireworks. We're talking about a man who's literally written the textbook and written the rules, including having written entire chapters and portions of the code for the National Fire Protection Association codes relating to both consumer and display fireworks. So we're bringing out the big guns here today, and we're happy to be joined by Dr. John Steinberg. Doctor, how are you today?
Doing well. Good morning, Bill. Let me dial back 3 elements of hyperbole really quickly. Number one, when you said rank amateurs playing with explosives, it's great for drama, but the whole point of the consumer fireworks industry is that these products are appropriate for the general public. And if you follow the directions, they should carry no more danger to the user of these products than using a can of bug spray in the backyard. The second is, I like the drama, celebrating the nation's independence by blowing up a part of it. But really, the only thing we want to blow up is the fireworks themselves. I was asked one time by a sponsor, what's your definition of a successful fireworks show? And my response after thinking was, basically when everybody in the audience and the performers looks pretty much the same afterwards as they did before. The third is, I appreciate your compliments. Yes, I'm the principal author of the textbook on display operator training. But when it gets to the part about writing the National Fire Code, the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association codes, I serve as one of many authors on a technical committee of over 30 people, and no one of us can claim authorship for a chapter or a document, nor speak on behalf of the NFPA. Although, yes, there are parts of the code when I'm looking at it with a fire marshal and I say, yes, I wrote that sentence. So, yeah, there is that, but it's a collective effort. And with that, I'm happy to work with you on this very timely broadcast, as we are getting ready to go through the peak season of fireworks in both professional displays and consumer products. And indeed, the misuse or misadventures that occur with fireworks have led to a lot of interesting matters for attorneys on both sides of civil litigation, insurers, and other parties to deal with.
I appreciate the correctives in and where appropriate. Honestly, we could spend the entire time we've got here today just kind of parsing your resume. It's fascinating. I note that I introduced you at the beginning, right, as Dr. Steinberg, and you are a doctor. You're a medical doctor. Before we get into the kind of nuts and bolts here, how is it that you came to be involved in fireworks?
The short version of a 3-decade story is, as a kid, I was always fascinated by science. I actually knew pretty early I wanted to go into life sciences and be a physician because I couldn't master the math required to do physics. So I knew right away I was going to be a life science guy. I was also fascinated by the chemistry of pyrotechnics, colors, the effects in the air. And later in life, after developing a medical career, I apprenticed with a fireworks display company. They steered me to the organization, the Pyrotechnics Guild International. of which I ultimately became president in 1998. That organization had a seat on the Fire Code Committee at NFPA. So I was introduced to my future contractual employers in law enforcement. They also needed training programs. And while I was not really the best pyrotechnician, I had a lot of experience as a teacher. So I organized their training programs and put together a textbook, became a member of the NFPA technical committees, and got involved in generating fire code. And of course, I got my own display operator license, and I've been conducting pyrotechnic displays professionally in Maryland since 1994. So my interests are in chemistry and display fireworks, consumer fireworks, and the safe use and enjoyment of fireworks in any capacity.
As you know, we're a law firm here, and this podcast is affiliated with the law firm Flaherty, Fardo, Rogel, and Amick, which is a personal injury law firm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I believe I saw on your resume you were involved in putting on the bicentennial display for the city of Pittsburgh. Is that right?
Yeah, I seem to remember a lot of hot afternoons out on the Fort Pitt Bridge wiring in one device after another. But, from the barge, when we did the display, it actually looked quite impressive.
I'm glad that it, displayed well for the people who were doing it and not just those watching. Anyway, so what I want to talk about today is primarily, in some sense, it's the intersection of your of the medical profession and your interest in pyrotechnics, right? I don't know how reliable these numbers are. I assume you've encountered better numbers than I have, but I've seen something in the range of 10,000 emergency room visits being typical in a given year for fireworks-related injuries.
Yeah, everything at the end blowed up. Blowed up good. Blowed up real good.
And from what I've seen, at least in the last couple of years, you're looking at anywhere in the range of half a dozen to a dozen fatalities associated with the use of fireworks. Are those numbers right?
All right, well, let's sort of dissect those numbers. One is there is a reporting system called NICE, National Information from Emergency Services Systems, I believe. And to get categorized as a fireworks injury, I could be going to the store to purchase consumer fireworks and getting them out of my car and tripping and falling over my kid's skateboard and have it recorded as a fireworks-related injury. So I prefer the statistic that is given in two parts. One, yes, there are fireworks injuries and fatalities every year, and that is an unfortunate aspect of this, as there are swimming pool accidents, lawnmower accidents, bicycle accidents, etc. The second part of that, and the statistic that I think the industry really is proud of, is that in a per-use statistic, that is, when you look at millions of pounds of fireworks used compared to the number of injuries, fireworks safety has actually been increasing, in that as the use of fireworks has expanded, the proportionate or per capita, if you will, rate of accidents has declined. Now, that said, there are basically three types of accidents, and I assume you want to focus on consumer fireworks, or would you rather include display fireworks as well?
I mean, I'm happy to hear about both.
All right. So the three broad types of misadventures that lead to adverse outcomes with fireworks are, first and foremost, if the product is defective. And this is certainly not intentional, but defective products occur in every industry, from computers to automobiles. And problems in manufacture, impermissible use of chemicals. As an example, a lot of fireworks are manufactured in China, and different markets have different requirements. The USA used to be the biggest importer of Chinese fireworks. We're now actually, I think, the third. Domestic consumption in China is number one. Export to other markets such as South America and Europe. Canada is number two, and the U.S. is number three. But sometimes things that would be permissible in one market and not in the United States are inadvertently imported despite testing protocols and procedures designed to prohibit that. And then there are products that can be misassembled, defective materials, etc. So product defects are one type of occurrence where there's a breach in the industry standard or code required for the performance of the device. The second broad category is operator error. Do not put hand or face over fireworks. If it says use on firm level surface, do not hold in hand, And we have in these reloadable aerial shells any number of fatal outcomes where people take the launcher and put it on their heads or on their chests. Or one case I worked as an expert in Texas, they wanted to hold it up in the air. It's going 200 feet in the air, 100 to 200 feet in the air. What difference does 3 or 4 more feet make? And of course, not being supported, the bottom blew out and injured the fellow. And then the third is when you get into confounding variables. As an example, the use of alcohol, the failure to supervise minors. So the product isn't defective and somebody actually read the warning labels, but there's some third factor, typically alcohol, failure to supervise children when they're, getting burned by sparklers because no adult is supervising them properly, etc. So I'd say those are the 3 broad categories to recap. Product defect, operator error or misuse, and contributing factor that leads to an adverse occurrence.
Great, thanks. And I want to talk about each of these a little bit, and to specifically on my end focus upon the legal angles that are in play in them. But let me just start here. We do a segment that we periodically call Case or No Case, where we go over a fact pattern and then assess whether or not we think that the fact pattern in question is actually an appropriate place where there's a reasonable lawsuit, a reasonable case, a reasonable claim for recovery. I'm just going to jump out there and put the answer first. If you're launching a firework off your head and it burns you or injures you, potentially seriously or fatally, no case. Don't launch fireworks off your head. That's on you if you do that. I don't care how much alcohol you've had in the day. That's never a good decision.
Last year we had a resident, and alcohol was involved, take one of these and hold it up to his head, and it was a fatality. So today you're going to see how very powerful these are. We're going to take one of these and take it and put it inside of one of the watermelons we have. Now, consistency of a human head. See how thick that is?
I guess I'd like to start by talking about operator error. And you had mentioned there's a difference between display fireworks and consumer fireworks. Can you just tell us what you mean by those terms when you use them?
All right. Well, let's go back to your example about not having a case if you launch a firework off your head first. I think you guys are aware most of the work I do is defense work. I'm more often retained as an expert on the defense side of civil litigation and the defense side in criminal matters than I am for plaintiffs in civil litigation. But one of the really interesting things about that is you can have operator misuse and still have a case. As an example, do not hold in hand. Well, if you do not hold in hand and decide, maybe that's not such a necessary thing. I'd like to hold the firework and throw it, and it blows up in your hand. And then this is getting into, I'm outside of my area. I'm a physician who's a fireworks expert. You're the attorney. But as I understand it in lay terms, if you make a product that has a foreseeable misuse and you have steps that you can take to prevent an adverse event, a bad outcome from that foreseeable misuse, and you don't do it, there may be a case. And I'll give you a specific example. A case in Missouri, there's a little ball on top of a rocket, and you're supposed to light the fuse to the rocket, and it goes up in the air, and the ball goes bang and does your effect. And one of our requirements for a type of explosive called flash powder, which is very energetic, is you can't have more than 130 milligrams. That's like 1/10 of a gram. It's like 3/100 of an ounce in the firework because it's very explosive, very powerful. And in this case, the firework had 25 grams of flash powder, way beyond the bound of permissibility. So what happened was when this fellow lit the rocket, it kind of blooped out and fell over and struck a rock, and the ball popped off. And he picked up the ball, which had a little fuse coming out of the bottom, thinking, well, I'll just light the fuse on the ball and throw it, not realizing it was a much faster fuse than the one that went into the rocket. And as soon as he lit it, it exploded and blew off half his arm. So when I sat for the deposition, and the deposing attorney, oddly enough, was using me in another case as a defense expert, so he wasn't going to impeach my credibility. And he said, well, it said do not hold in hand. Yes, sir. That was operator misuse. Yes, sir. That was clearly against the way it was supposed to be used. Absolutely. And then the plaintiff's attorney said, and had it been a lawful product, my client would have had a couple of scorch marks on his fingers. But because it was an illegal, impermissible breach of standard product, it blew his hand off. As you guys know, if things were simple, we wouldn't need lawyers to sort them out.
That's right.
So that aside, whether or not there's a case when there's an injury, the fact that it's an accident or misuse doesn't settle it. You really have to look at the specifics. And obviously, if it's a lawful product and you're grossly misusing it, you stick your face over the tube and shoot yourself in the eye, okay, that's on you.
Let's go blow some shit up.
Blow some shit up.
Now, back to the next thing. So you asked at the end of it, what are some of the differences between display fireworks and consumer fireworks? And, obviously, if this, like I say, if the litigation aspect were simple, you wouldn't need to do podcasts and have proceedings, et cetera. As an aside, before I tell you the difference between consumer and display fireworks, I was raised by lawyers. My father was a trial judge in Maryland. My cousins are attorneys. And one day, my dad, who was a circuit court judge, was playing law professor, one of my cousins, who was a third-year law student, and his beeper had gone off. And he said, policeman's going to come and ask me to sign a search warrant. And what's the standard I should use? And my cousin, Ian, said, if the evidence presented would lead a reasonable man to conclude that a crime had been committed, it said, and I looked at the two of them, the judge and the future lawyer, and I said, listen, guys, if there were reasonable men, we wouldn't need lawyers. So in any case.
Well, way to avoid going into the family business, Doc. I think you got the better part of it.
Who knows? Now I wind up spending half of my life working with lawyers anyway. So here we go. Display fireworks and consumer fireworks are exactly the same with one difference. They use the same explosive materials, the same black powder lift charge, the same color producer effects, the same metal powders. Display fireworks and consumer fireworks are exactly the same with one difference. Consumer fireworks use smaller amounts of the materials that are energetic. They wrap them in smaller individual containers, and they have weight and size limits that keep them out of the broad category of display fireworks, which are regulated by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, our ATF friends, as explosives. So to stay out of the regulated end, it could be the same thing, the same chemicals, the same mixtures, the same black powder, but it's in smaller quantities with limits on how much you can have. And that's the broadest differentiation between consumer fireworks and display fireworks. The second is when you get outside of the weight limits that are the restricted maximum for consumer fireworks, the second feature is display fireworks are for sale to professionals only. Part of being a regulated explosive means that it can only be used by a professional who has the appropriate licensure, training, and experience to handle that type of material. Whereas consumer fireworks are judged to be safe if they adhere to industry standards, codes, and regulations, and are properly labeled to be placed in the hands of the general public for consumer use, requiring no particular training or prior experience.
Okay, so let me ask you this then. I, with no professional licensure whatsoever in this field, I can't walk into one of these kind of pop-up tents or seasonal fireworks stores that opens up. Anything I buy in there is a consumer firework, right? I can't buy display fireworks kind of accidentally or by walking into a store, correct?
If you have gotten a hold of display fireworks, the person selling to you has committed a breach of federal law.
And I know that the state laws have changed a bunch and here in Pennsylvania over recent years, as far as really liberalizing and allowing the purchase of a much broader array. I don't think people are driving across the border into Ohio to buy fireworks anymore, which, when I was in high school was very much a thing. But the display fireworks, those are federally regulated, and so those rules are going to be the same state to state, correct?
Correct. Federal regulations on explosives, including display fireworks, are the same with respect to transportation and possession and sale. The states, the National Fire Protection Association has an adamant organizational position against the use of consumer fireworks. They are the authors of the slogan, "Leave it to the professionals." Nevertheless, despite that organized opposition, the use of consumer fireworks in the United States has been both broader and deeper with each passing year. More and more jurisdictions over the last 20 years have promulgated regulations that allow consumer fireworks in one type or another. They may be somewhat limited, such as in my state of Maryland, where we're limited to what we call safe and sane non-aerial stuff, things like fountains and produce sprays of sparks and things that go off on the ground. Whereas in other jurisdictions, the full array of consumer fireworks, including rockets and aerials and shells and multi-tube devices, is allowed for sale. And of course, as you mentioned, people want to use fireworks. I'm sure there are plenty of Marylanders who drive up to your state, Pennsylvania, and purchase fireworks that they can't buy in Maryland and want to use them here.
Now, legally, if I do that, if I've crossed state lines to buy a firework that's available in Pennsylvania but not in Maryland, and then I'm injured by it, in your experience, has that affected these claims or people's ability to recover if they're injured?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So if I drive up to Pennsylvania and buy some reloadable aerials and bring them back to Maryland, the purchase was legal in Pennsylvania. The firework is per se legal. It doesn't breach any federal standards, and it doesn't really breach Maryland standards. In Maryland, the possession, the storage, the transportation of that firework would be legal. It's only the sale or discharge of it that would be illegal. So I'm using fireworks in breach of state law, and something bad happens, and I want to bring a case. So I'll give you an example. I worked as an expert on a case in New York State. And the injured person was a New York State trooper. And the New York State trooper drove to Pennsylvania and purchased a reloadable aerial firework. And he took it back home, and he followed all the procedures for use. He set the reloadable aerial firework on a firm plywood surface, and he lit the fuse, and he had his neighbor over. And they got back up on the porch, and they were 62 feet away from the firework. And when the fuse went down in the tube, the firework exploded violently instead of propelling in the air. And it kicked a concrete plug that formed the base of the mortar tube in the direction of the person who lit it, and it hit him in the eye and took his eye out.
Of course, you got 360 degrees where that thing could go firing off to. Of course, it fires right back into his eye.
And as a further complication, because he was now limited to monocular vision, he only had one eye, he lost his job as a state trooper. So he wanted to make a claim that this was a defective product, that never mind he was breaking the law, which he was charged with enforcing, having brought the product back into New York State and against or contrary to state regulations had launched an aerial shell. He nevertheless made the claim that, I broke the rules and, I shouldn't have done it, but that's a defective product. It's not supposed to explode in the tube. It's supposed to go in the air. And if the product weren't defective, I wouldn't have been injured. And the case never went to trial. I was, in that case, a plaintiff's expert, not a defense expert. And, that's another thing. Attorneys get a lot of bad rap. Experts, the hired guns, you'll say anything. No. I told you, I was raised by lawyers and a judge. The role of the forensic expert is to tell the retaining party what you're dealing with. It is not the job of an expert to litigate the case. That's the lawyers. It's not up to the expert to win the case. It's not up to the expert to determine credibility. That's for the finder of fact, the judge or the jury. It's simply to state and answer to technical questions. And all I would do is state, this product was defective. The standards require it to be launched in a near vertical path into the air. And because I'm a physician and fairly expert in injuries, I mean, I know how to read a medical chart, I could also state that the injuries were consistent with the concrete plug from the base of the mortar striking the eye. And then I'll leave it to the attorneys to decide what to do. In that case, a settlement was reached. It never went to trial. But the summary of that long tangential question is, yes, even in cases where the use of a defective product in that jurisdiction is contrary to local or state regulation, a successful claim may be brought in that had your product not been defective, my breach of local regulations would not have caused a devastating injury.
It's interesting. There is and when I say a lot, I mean a lot of law and of nuanced law surrounding the idea of a quote unquote defective product. We have listeners out there who are familiar with the phrase products liability, right, as kind of a whole genre of cases, or strict liability, which is a kind of liability that attaches in the case of one of these defective products. So I want to talk about a couple things when it comes to product defect questions generally. The first of which is, and I think you've seen this in your practice, Dr. Steinberg, is when you find that the product is defective, simply alleging that the user of the product was negligent or violated the law in some way does not matter. It does not relieve the liability for the defective product. The liability for the defective product kind of comes first and is set in stone, irrespective of any act of negligence, because the idea is strict liability kind of supersedes any claim for negligence. So now you'd mentioned foreseeable misuse. That kind of falls within the causation ambit for strict liability. And so if I use the product in a way that is negligent but foreseeable, the person who sold me the defective product or who manufactured the defective product or whatever remains liable for the consequences. Now, if I find some completely ridiculous new novel way to misuse the product that is not foreseeable, that's a different question, right? This comes back to launching the firework off our head. No one's ever tried that before.
Or other parts. I was sort of smiling, thinking of some YouTube videos I've seen. But
for sure.
Is it lit? Is it lit? Oh, I feel it. Oh, I felt it.
I remember something similarly not properly rated for our use from the Jackass movie back those decades ago when that was a thing. So products liability does not require any negligence, knowledge, or wrongful act by the defendant. You only examine the product itself. And if the product is defective, everybody and anybody on the kind of chain of custody and sale of that product is a theoretical defendant. The person who sold it to you, the person who imported it into the country, the person who manufactured it, whatever. That's especially important because, as you said, Doctor, a lot of the fireworks that we use are kind of imported from China. And if our only remedy for a defective shell was to try to figure out who made it in China and sue them and figure out how to either collect against a judgment against them here or to sue them in China?
You want to sue me?
Well, why not?
Me?
Sue everybody.
You know, I have no idea what the civil court system in China looks like, but certainly I couldn't do anything there. You would have injured people with no meaningful remedy. So it's tough for the person who sells the consumer firework or the person who distributes it to the seller. Any of those people can end up on the hook for a product that they had no reason to know was itself defective. They don't have to inspect it when it comes into their shop. And whether they do or don't inspect it, and whether they do or don't use reasonable care is irrelevant. They're part of the chain that gets that to you. And I'm assuming that's usually what you're seeing in these kind of defective product situations, right? Is the lawsuits that you're being brought in as an expert on are against not the manufacturer, but some local distributor or warehouse, some retail operation or wholesale operation as opposed to the manufacturer. Is that right?
Not entirely.
Oh, okay, good. Fix it.
Let me step out of my lane for one brief second.
Come on over here. The water's good.
Having worked with so many attorneys, you mentioned three legal doctrines. One is product liability, which varies jurisdictionally. And I'll leave it to the lawyers to explain to other lawyers what strict product liability means. But that does have some variation jurisdictionally. The second is foreseeable misuse. And typically, the nut on which foreseeable misuse hangs is that you were aware enough of it to build preventative measures from an adverse outcome into your codes and standards. And the third legal argument or legal line of reasoning is when you talked about negligence, and the difference between contributory and comparative negligence also varies jurisdictionally. So I'll leave it to the lawyers to discuss that. But those three legalisms aside, strict product liability, what is foreseeable misuse, and is there a standard of comparative or contributory negligence in the jurisdiction? Getting back to your question, which is people don't typically go against the manufacturer, and that's not necessarily true. I'm working on a case not in your state right now involving display fireworks. This is where I'm retained by the plaintiffs. And the product manufacturer, Display Fireworks, is an industry leader, a very, very reputable Chinese manufacturer of display fireworks. And there was an allegation of a product defect. The aerial shell went off too low to the ground, went off low enough that it caused injury to the operators. Because this is an active litigation, I want to parse my words carefully. But there was an identified causation, an identifiable means by which the accident could have occurred, the malfunction, that was easily remedied with an inexpensive minor change in manufacture. That gets into a whole other legal standard. I could prevent all accidents if I put them in steel bunkers and made them, weigh 4 tons and operate them 200 feet away. And part of the reasonability standard is, can you fix something to prevent a foreseeable misuse-related accident that is economically and practicably feasible? You're not required to make it absolutely error-proof. But circling back to the manufacturer, the responsible manufacturers of consumer fireworks and display fireworks in China have U.S. agents and will accept service and often are targets and defendants and will defend claims. That said, not all fireworks manufacturers in China are traceable, and that's why we have the laws we have in the United States to protect American citizens who are harmed by defective products or other breaches of industry standards, codes, regulations, etc. So I wouldn't say that all Chinese manufacturers are beyond the reach of litigation, and indeed will defend claims and will appear in the U.S. courts and will accept service of appropriate documents. So I guess one of the lessons is in display fireworks, when I'm out on the field, it's nice using product that I know if something bad happens, the people who made it will stand up and say, yeah, if we did it, we own it, we'll help. As opposed to, I don't know where this came from, but hey, let's try it. Now, it's harder in consumer fireworks because in China, consumer fireworks are assembled, and there's been a huge constriction. The Chinese are trying to centralize the manufacture of fireworks into just a couple of provinces and to have factories that are designated use and really, really standardize and streamline things. But even then, you still can't necessarily find out exactly where the product was made. There's another example. It could have been made, a consumer firework product could have been made for a whole bunch of customers, and the only thing different is the outside labeling and the wrapper and the brand name. But that device is actually going to be sold under different names in different countries to different customers. So typically, if something bad happens and you think the product was either defective or defective in a manner that there was a foreseeable misuse that could have been mitigated by appropriate steps and wasn't, then your targets are going to be the people who imported it, distributed it, sold it, etc.
Yeah. Now, you had mentioned at the beginning, right, 3 categories, kind of defective products, operator error, and confounding variables. Let me get back to the confounding variables momentarily, but I think it's interesting that while these are kind of three different factors or types of causes for a firework-related injury, it turns out they can overlap or coexist a lot. Like you had mentioned, right? The gentleman picks it up and throws it from his hand, but the fuse goes too fast and it explodes in his hand. We've got a combination of operator error and a defective product because there was way too much black powder in that firework, and that caused the injury coexisting with this particular foreseeable error. I am not going to guess whether or not this individual in question was under the influence of any alcohol on the particular day in question. But I think the closer you get to the holidays, the more likely you are that someone who's using consumer fireworks is doing so in at least not an entirely sober state. It also helps that they're probably doing it at night where they can't see as well. They can't, read things as well. They may be doing it in a group of family. They may be allowing children to be involved in this process. And these factors all actually overlap and coexist, and kind of parsing out how much of the respective fault or what the effect is of operator error versus defective product versus these confounding factors you spoke of is actually probably a not insignificant role in a lot of these cases, right? So even if you've got user error, it does not necessarily shut the door on you unless it's particularly egregious user error, or, the product isn't defective, right? It's just user error by itself. A product functions exactly as it wants, but if I aim it at the house and it burns down the house, that's not the product's fault, right?
Yeah, you could even have a trifecta. You could have a parent who bought the fireworks and feels, here, I'm a little too drunk to set this off, and gives it to a child who then misuses it by throwing it in his hand. And when it goes off, it turns out to be impermissibly loaded and have much more explosive force than permitted. So you wind up with all three.
Now, if I want to protect myself from these types of outcomes, right? If I'm a consumer using a firework, what should I be doing? What should I do to stay safe?
Okay. Well, there's an organization called the American Pyrotechnics Safety and Education Foundation, APSEF. It's a 501c3 nonprofit educational entity. And it's the successor to the National Council on Fireworks Safety. I served on the boards of the NCSF and now serve on the board of directors of APSEF. And we promulgate safety guidelines. And there are a whole list of them. I don't think I can give them to you from memory, but the big ones are: buy your fireworks from a reputable dealer. This is not something you want to buy from Uncle Vinny off the back of a pickup truck, or Joe down the road who has stuff he sells. So you want a reputable dealer, a commercial business that has lawful product that complies with all state regulations. Number two, read and follow the labels. These labels are specifically worded according to industry standards and are one of the prime means of mitigating against harm from foreseeable misuses. All the stuff that's happened, we've already figured out what to tell you not to do. So, they say the wise man learns from the mistakes of others. You can profit by this by reading and following the labels. Number three, the person who's using the fireworks should consume no alcohol and take responsibility proactively for safety, making sure the viewing audience is at a safe distance. It isn't specified in consumer fireworks the way we do in display fireworks, where we have specific distance requirements, but a rough rule of thumb, 40 feet from an aerial device, 20 feet from a ground device. You want to make sure that the fireworks are used appropriately. They're on a firm level surface. They're ignited properly with a punk or a, barbecue type lighter. You're not using a cigarette butt. I'll say it again, no alcohol is to be consumed by anyone handling, setting up, or lighting the fireworks. And then you want, in following the directions, to light one device at a time. Don't make any alterations to it. Don't put any part of your body over it. When it's done, put it in a receptacle away from the house. One of the standards for fireworks, we test the fireworks, is that 30 minutes after use a thermal heat imaging gun. There should be no temperature above 125 degrees. but they're made of cardboard and fire generating material. Every once in a while, something smolders. If it's in a bag in your garage, it leads to a house fire, and the evidence is burned up. We don't know what the temperature was. The bottom line is we've learned about all these things. So we've taken steps in firework construction to make sure the temperatures won't be impermissibly high, leading to reignition, but follow the warning labels.
I've had like a Roman candle or that sort of thing in the past, right? They're kind of small. Sometimes the paper's a little crinkly around them. You got this small print warning label that goes on and on and on, wrapping around this thing. Am I really supposed to read that whole label?
The standards for labels on devices in both consumer law, the Consumer Product Safety Act enacted in 1972, in which Congress gave the Consumer Product Safety Commission regulatory oversight, which also included, by the way, the Hazardous Substance Act, separate federal statute, specifies where the label has to be, what size it has to be, whether it's on the outside package, on a bundle, on the individual device, how tall the letters have to be, etc. But the short answer to your question is yes. I'm wearing reading glasses. I buy products where I have to use the drugstore 3.25 readers to read the labels. But if the product carries risk to my vision or something else, yeah, I'm going to read the label. So that's the A part. Yeah, you ought to read the label because that label is where it's supposed to be, of the size it's supposed to be consistent with industry standard and federal regulations. The second is Roman candles. If ever do not hold in hand was applicable and foreseeably breached. So let me give you a couple of examples about Roman candles. Number one, if you want to use them properly, you get a bucket, you fill it with sand, you put the Roman candle in the bucket, you light the fuse. Now, what have we done? I say we. I'm not part of the industry. I'm an innocent bystander. I take plaintiffs' cases as well. If they're a legitimate case, I'll help you sort it out. On the other hand, what the industry has done is in Roman candles, the bottom 2.5 inches is typically inert. They've left empty space because they know people are going to hold it in their hands. And one of the ways you can prevent a foreseeable accidental injury, for instance, there's a malfunction. The bottom last thing blows up in the tube instead of going out the top. Well, if the part you could reasonably hold in your hand were inert, we could prevent that accident. So I've watched the evolution of this industry over 30 years be very proactive in taking steps. Nevertheless, if you hold a Roman candle in your hand and you happen to be around the part that isn't inert and the shell blows up in the tube, if it's a legal permissible shell for consumer fireworks, you're going to have an ouch. Like, that's smart. That was not a good idea. Of course, if you're shooting at someone and you hit them in the eye, that's a whole different kettle of fish.
No, surely no one would ever hold a Roman candle and shoot colored fireballs at people from their hands.
So, I worked a case again. This was on the plaintiff's side with the Roman candle. When we looked at the other Roman candles in the package the fellow had bought, that flash powder stuff I told you that was really explosive, where you're limited to 130 milligrams, had about 20 times that, 2.6, 2.7 grams of flash powder. So the injury caused a loss of several fingers instead of a scorch mark. So again, this is, I've been fascinated to learn from defense and plaintiffs' attorneys. And, over the years, as I've worked any number of cases to see, what happened. That's my job. Here's what happened. Here's what the applicable standards are. Here's what it should do, how it should have been made. And then watch as a participant in the proceedings to how the case is litigated, to see how things play out and what weight's given, what form. But to recap, if it's got a label on it and you bought from a legitimate manufacturer, then that label is where it's supposed to be, of the size it's supposed to be to conform with regulations, and you ought to read it. And number two, you ought to adhere to what it says.
And apparently, 3, you need to have your designated pyro, which really puts a damper on your 4th of July party if you have to stay sober all day because you're the one setting off the fireworks later. But it does make sense.
Well, that depends. So if you want another, if you want a funny alcohol pyro story.
Has anyone ever said no to that?
There are a lot of regional fireworks clubs where enthusiasts and hobbyists make and shoot fireworks and put on displays. So one evening at one of these club events that where I was in attendance, and I don't drink any alcohol at all, so it doesn't bother me. This fella comes up to me. If he's listening, he's down in Virginia. He comes up to me. He wants to light some 8-inch shells. These are big display shells. They're the size, of a bowling ball. And part of lighting 8-inch shells by hand in code is the operator has to be at least 75 feet away when the lift charge goes off. So we use a delay fuse. And the delay fuse, a lot of people are familiar with it's called cannon fuse or visco fuse. So this fellow, we'll call him Sam. That's not even his real first name. He says, well, how long should I use a piece of fuse so I can be far enough away when the 8-inch shell goes off? Foreseeable malfunction could go off in the tube, okay, instead of launch. So I held up my fingers and said, about that much ought to do it. And then he thought for a minute. He said, I've been drinking a few beers and, they're members here. And I think he was one of the officers of the club. He says, I shouldn't commit a breach of error. I've been drinking. So would you mind lighting them for me? I just, I want to see how they perform. And I said, okay. And so I started cutting some pieces of this fuse and they were this long. Mm-hmm. He goes, I thought you said this much was enough. I said, yeah, if you're lighting them. Yeah, he felt really betrayed. I said, if I'm lighting them, I want that much.
But just make it 75 feet. I can just light it from my position of safety and let it burn all the way home. Yeah,
but he'd been drinking and he realized, no, our rule is if you've had any alcohol, we don't want to get into what your breathalyzer alcohol level, how many. No, if you've had any alcohol, you don't shoot fireworks. And as to, safety, an occasion in Virginia where the manufacturer in China put a warning label in there for a device that could be lit by hand. It was a box of tubes, what we call a cake. And when you open it up, the manufacturer put a white piece of paper in there that said the operator should be 100 meters away when the device discharges, and the audience should be 250 meters away. And it could be lit by hand. And the attorney deposing me said, wait a minute, how can you light this by hand and be 100 meters away when it starts to fire?
I'm envisioning firing flaming arrows at it from afar.
Right? I said, you use a delay fuse, this cannon fuse. And he goes, how long would that have to be for you to be 100 meters away? And I smiled and said, how fast can you run? So, these are the moments you live for in depositions or trial when someone just hands you, the setup.
And obviously you want to make sure you had given a kind of cardinal rule of 40 feet away from anything aerial and 20 feet away from anything on the ground. And I would assume approximately the same distances apply to staying away from homes or vehicles. And anything where, you could cause that sort of damage as well.
Well, that leads to three interesting questions. Number one, I didn't say it was a rule, accepted in the rule of thumb. It's not promulgated. It's not an industry standard. It's not required anywhere. This is my personal opinion, with many decades of experience. I wouldn't want my audience closer than 40 feet to an aerial. I wouldn't want them more than 20 feet close to a ground level effect if I were the operator. Remember, I'm wearing safety glasses. I'm sober. I'm aware of situational awareness of where things are. Now, the second is, you talked about distances, the second and third thing. The code for display of fireworks, NFPA document 1123, currently in the 2022 edition, gives distances, including don't shoot fireworks within 25 feet of an overhead object, a tree limb, a power line, because it could bounce back down into the audience. Don't fire fireworks within 100 feet of a tent, within 210 feet of the audience, within, etc. So this is not applicable to consumer fireworks. In Chapter 1 of our document for professional displays called Scope, it says it doesn't apply to the use of consumer fireworks by the general public. Nevertheless, there may be some lessons in there that are inherent. So when I talked about situational awareness, the third part is, even though there's no distance given, no, you don't want to be shooting fireworks on the tarmac of a gasoline station next to pumps dispensing flammable fuel. Where are the homes? What types of roofs do they have? Where's your fire suppression? Do you have a hose? Do you have a bucket of water? In fireworks as in so much of life, there are two types of people. There are people who say, A, nothing bad will ever happen to me. And B, people who say, something bad could happen. And if it does, how do I make it of minimal problems? Type A are the people you wind up and I wind up dealing with who have horrible outcomes. You want part 3, no specifics, but situational awareness. Is there a pile of rubbish that could catch on fire? Is there a kid's playground? What are you doing? So, fireworks are a product, consumer fireworks, again, perfectly okay to sell to untrained folks. Follow the rules, go ahead and use them. But it's the same as with a lawnmower or your car. There's certain rules of the road, and you want to be aware of them and follow them. So I agree with you. Think about what you're doing, where you're shooting the fireworks, who's around, what's around.
So 2 last things, I think, before we wrap here. One of the things you mentioned that was interesting, because I've never done it or thought about it before, has to do with what you do with kind of the remnants of your fireworks to dispose of them at the end of your show or your display, or your fooling around for yourself at home, to store them away from the house, and I guess to get them wet.
Okay, you don't have to wet them down. All that should be left is cardboard. But in the display firework industry, we have stipulated minimum amounts of time. After the show, we got to wait a certain amount of time to approach the tubes. So one hazard after you're done the display is there could be something in there that didn't fire but could fire later. So we allow a certain amount of time in consumer fireworks after you've fired the device, the multi-tube device in particular, because obviously if it's a one-shot aerial shell, it either went where it didn't. And that's part of the safety guidelines, is if you light an aerial shell and it doesn't fire, leave it alone for 30 minutes. Don't pull it out. Don't try to manipulate the fuse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I give you a rough rule of thumb of a half an hour. If something misfires, don't approach it for half an hour. Kick it to the side. Put a bucket over, just push it aside. Now, after you've fired all your fireworks from a nice firm platform, concrete, asphalt, 3/4 inch thick plywood, whatever, and the show's over and everybody's happy and they're going back to the rest of the evening's activities, leave the stuff out overnight. Don't put it in a garage. If you want to put it in a container, like, a 30-gallon trash can, don't put it up against the side of the house. Again, remember that type B person? Well, something bad could happen, and if it does, how do I minimize the damage? Okay, the fireworks could smolder and could catch on fire. If the trash can's 10 feet from the house, I'll have a melted trash can in the morning. If it's in the house or next to the house, I'm going to have a big problem. So those 2 things, after the fireworks are fired, give them 30 minutes before you pick them up or approach them. And number 2, when you're finished and you've gathered up the debris and you've waited the appropriate time, put them in a can or receptacle and leave them outside of the house.
Thanks. And I think there's one more tip out there, and I think you've half answered it already in your last answer, right? But it's the first scenario that we kind of think of where we on the consumer end of things are like, I don't know what to do. Boy, I wish I'd really thought of this. You light the fuse burns down, it burns in, and no lift. Nothing happens. You've got a dud or not, depending, I suppose. What should I do, right? If my fuse has burned down and now I've got this firework that's just sitting there, kind of looking at me.
Okay. Technical terms, that's a misfire. A dud is when the lift charge goes and the thing goes up in the air and falls back to the ground because it never exploded in the air. But if you have a misfire, you lit the fuse and it didn't go off, okay, you can walk up and look at the device after 30 minutes. If you didn't light the fuse, cannon fuse has this lacquer on the outside, and a lot of times people light it, and it looks like the fuse is burning, but it never hits the powder train in the center. So if you walk back up to the tube device after waiting your 30 minutes and you see the same 1.5 inch fuse sticking out, okay, you can relight the fuse. Now I know the labels say don't relight, but that means after the fuse actually burned. If the fuse never burned, you're not relighting. You didn't light it in the first place. Now, if you did light the fuse and it burned into the device and didn't function, you put that device aside, you let it cool overnight, and if it's still got live material, what I recommend is you take it back to the store where you bought it. You take it back to the tent and say, hey, I don't need a refund or anything, whatever. Maybe you do want a refund. Maybe they offer you a refund, if the device didn't work. But the bottom line is, if it's still got explosive material in it, you don't want to throw it in the general garbage. You really don't want to do that. So what do you do if the device doesn't work? You wait 30 minutes before approaching it. You don't try to manipulate it, modify it, or relight it. And then you keep it stored overnight outside of the house. So if it does go off later, no one is hurt. And then you take it back to where you got it and ask them to safely dispose of it, because all the fireworks distributors have a means to dispose of potentially or actually hazardous waste in a lawful and safe manner.
All of my instincts tell me to throw that thing in a bucket of water. I don't know if the chemicals in there are chemicals that are going to play well if they're thrown in a bucket of water. But I'm concerned about how I'm getting it back to the person I purchased it from. It becomes their problem once I hand it to them. But in my car between here and there, I'm still kind of worried about that thing back there. Well,
After 30 minutes, pretty much isn't going to go off. And if it's the next day, I guarantee you it isn't going to go off spontaneously. As to pouring water on it, it just makes it more of a mess for everybody who's got to handle it. It doesn't really do anything. The passage of time, as we say in medicine, tincture of time. If it didn't go off after 30 minutes, you can pick it up and put it in the receptacle, leave it outside the house. If it didn't go off overnight, it ain't going to go off when you're driving it back to the tent or the store where you got it.
All right. Hey, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. It is much appreciated, and hopefully our listeners out there can use what they've learned from you to stay a little safer this 4th of July than maybe they have in the past. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Bill. It's been a pleasure working with you.
And thank you out there for joining us on this episode of I Strenuously Object. Please subscribe, rate, review the podcast. Let us know if you have any questions. We will happily accept your questions for our Mailing It In segment or for any feedback you have for the pod. That email address is iobject@pghfirm.com. Visit Flaherty Fardo's website. That's at pghfirm.com. We are also on Instagram at I Strenuously Object Podcast. Enjoy your holiday and stay safe out there, everyone. Until next time, some parting advice.
Once this comes at you, you can't stop it. You can't get out of the way of it. It comes out like a bullet.
So while it might look like a lot of fun, be warned, if you play with fire, you're gonna get burned.
Oh.